A pleasant day to you, icons and lady icons. Welcome to the 8th module of our discussion in the subject General Biology 1, and welcome to the second quarter. For this chapter, we're actually going to talk about the concept of photosynthesis. And as you can observe here, probably you already discussed this concept on your Science 9, and you're just actually going to have a short review of the different things that you already discussed on your Science 9, and at the same time, we're actually going to add a more deeper discussion that will simply be related with the previous discussions that we had, especially when it comes to the concept of cellular transport mechanisms and even the presence of biomolecules. Now, in the case of photosynthesis, going back on its most basic definition, photosynthesis, it is actually the process that converts light energy to chemical energy of food. Photosynthesis, it is actually done by the organisms known as the autotrophs, or these are the different organisms that are also known as the producers. Without the presence of these producers, light energy will not be converted to the chemical energy of food that we know in the form of glucose or in the form of different types of sugars. So always remember, in the case of the concept of photosynthesis, it is actually divided into two major terms. The first one, photo, which simply means light, and the second one, synthesis, which is now the creation of something. And the thing that will simply be created here in the process of photosynthesis is the food that is responsible for the sustenance of life on the ecosystem and here on our biosphere. So when it comes to photosynthesis, remember that the leaves are the major locations of photosynthesis or of this process. But please take note, not all plants are possessing leaves. Not all organisms are possessing leaves. There are also different types of organisms, just like different types of bacteria that can do photosynthesis, but they do not possess any leaves. But in this case, whenever we are talking about the presence of plants, the kingdom of Plantae, we are going to consider the presence of leaves, which are the natural power plants that is present among those eukaryotic organisms. But also remember that not all plants are possessing leaves. Some of these plants, for instance the stick plant, they can still do photosynthesis, but it is not happening on their leaves because the leaves are absent among these plants, but rather it is happening on their stems. Okay, so remember that whenever we're talking about photosynthesis in this context, we're just going to focus on the photosynthesis that is happening among leaves. Whenever we are talking about this particular process, their green color is from the presence of the chlorophyll, which is the green pigment that is present within the chloroplast. So remember, whenever we are talking about the concept of optics and the concept of colors, the light that is simply being bounced back by the different objects, these are the colors that we can actually perceive. So in this case, so we can actually infer that the color green light is being reflected by the leaves towards our color receptors on our eyes if our vision is actually normal and if we are not possessing any color blindness. So in this case, color green light simply bounces off the surface of leaves and it is now being perceived by our eyes, while the colors violet, blue, and even red and orange are being absorbed by the leaves. Okay, so that is the basic concept, the reason why leaves are colored green. But also remember that there are different types of pigments that is present among plants. We have chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A, it is the main pigment that is present among green plants. So in the case of chlorophyll A, it is most efficient in absorbing color violet and color blue light. Then it is also absorbing orange and red light. While in the case of chlorophyll B, the secondary color that is present among leaves, or the secondary pigment rather, it is now responsible for the absorption majority of violet and blue, and even absorption of orange light. While lastly, in the case of the carotenoids, just like what the name resonates to every single one of you, the one that is responsible for the presence of the orange pigment, the reason why it is orange or reddish when it comes to its pigment is because it is now reflecting the colors orange and red, but absorbing some part of lighter green, blue, and even violet. And we can actually observe here that when it comes to the rate of photosynthesis in the case of the action spectrum, these are now the concept of the release, and the utilization of the different colors of light. It is most efficient if the colors that will be absorbed by the leaves are present on the violet spectrum or the blue spectrum and even the orange and the red spectrum, but it is the least when it comes to the color green. So it simply means that they are just reflecting color green and they are not utilizing it for the formation of this process known as photosynthesis. Okay, so moving forward, so once again, just like what I stated earlier, in the case of the presence of this organelle, which is known as the chloroplast, it is now reflecting color green light but absorbing the different colors of light. Now, chloroplasts are structurally similar and likely evolved from photosynthetic bacteria. And if you can still recall our discussion when it comes to the endosymbiotic theory, if you can still recall that concept, that discussion that we had during the first quarter, remember that in the case of the endosymbiotic theory, it is actually theorized that the chloroplast and even the mitochondrion are separate entities and just engulfed and incorporated inside the cells of eukaryotic cells. So if you're going to observe here, on the right side, it is actually an example of a cyanobacteria, while on the left side, it is now an example of a eukaryotic chloroplast. And if you're actually going to compare, they're almost containing the same characteristics and even the presence of a nucleoid or the presence of DNA in this organelle and on this bacterium. So, if we're going to consider now the concept of endosymbiotic theory, chloroplast and mitochondrion are our basis for this certain type of theory. And now, when it comes to the presence of the leaves, majority of the photosynthetic parts are actually observed on the part known as the mesophyll. The mesophyll, it is now the interior, or if we are going to use the sandwich analogy, it is now inside the sandwich. It is now the spread, the very thick spread that is present on the epidermis or sandwich between two bonds, two epidermis, and at the center, it is now the presence of the mesophyll. The mesophyll, it is actually the one that contains the different types of cells that is responsible for the containment of the different types of chloroplast. The mesophyll cells, they're actually containing the chloroplast, and the different parts of the leaves are actually responsible now for the presence of water, exchange of gases, and other things that is necessary for the process of photosynthesis. For instance, the presence of the stomates, or also known as the stomata. The stomata, there are the different openings that is present on the epidermis of leaves. The stomata or the stomates are responsible now for the entrance and exit of gases. And if we're going to consider this, stomata is more abundant on the lower surface of the leaves and not on the upper surface. Why? Simply because of transpiration or the evaporation of water that is present among plants. Then another part, when it comes to a leaf, it is now the presence of the midrib. The midrib, it is now the center of the conduction of minerals and at the same time of water throughout the leaf. And as you can observe here, the presence of the phloem and the xylem, if you can still remember, when it comes to the different types of plant tissues probably that you had encountered during your Science 7 and in your Science 8, whenever we're talking about phloem is now responsible for the conduction of materials, just like the presence of minerals, the presence of glucose, the presence of starch. While in the case of the xylem, it is now responsible for the conduction of water. Xylem, it is for the water, while in the case of the phloem, it is now responsible for the conduction of food materials. Okay? Now, if you're actually going to observe the presence of the chloroplast, for instance, in this example, we have here the Edolea. An Edolea is actually an example of an aquatic organism. It is an example of an aquatic plant. You can observe here that the chloroplasts are actually moving in a cyclic manner because they are moving towards the presence of light. Okay, even the chloroplasts present on those cells, on those leaves, are actually seeking for light. The movement of the chloroplast that is present among the cells of these plants are actually related with the concept of phototropism, or it is now the time when plants are affiliated with the presence of light, or they are simply moving towards the light. And you can actually observe here on the canopies in the forest that all of these plants are actually reaching towards the light source. They are moving up, majority of these plants. Basics of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, it is actually a redox process in which water is oxidized and carbon dioxide is reduced. And photosynthesis is an example of an endergonic process in which the energy boost is provided by the light. Remember, whenever we are talking about endergonic and exergonic, endergonic, it is now entering that certain type of system. Okay? Then, if you're going to recall in the concept of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide will be reduced to glucose. Carbon dioxide will be reduced to glucose, and water will be oxidized to oxygen. Remember, in the case of reduction and oxidation, reduction, it is now the addition of electrons, while oxidation, it is now the removal of electrons, mostly of hydrogen ions. That is the reason why if carbon dioxide is reduced, it will now create glucose. Then in the case of water, if it is oxidized, it will now release oxygen. Okay, so basically that is simply the concept that we are going to consider when it comes to photosynthesis. But a short disclaimer, photosynthesis is not as simple as that. Because in the case of photosynthesis, always remember that there is the presence of the light reaction and the dark reaction, in which we are going to discuss on the next set of video discussions.